Growing up, I lived in a strange room. My name is Evan, and I was just a child back then, around 7 years old. The room was located on the top floor of an old house, a part that wasn't meant to be a bedroom at all. It had been converted from an attic or closet space, and the previous owners had turned it into a playroom for their children. This room, however, felt like a separate world to me. It was cut off from the rest of the house, and I would often feel a deep sense of isolation. The scariest part was the large closet at the far side of the room. It had a sliding door, and inside was a steep set of wooden stairs that led up to the attic. That attic was full of toys and old junk that I didn't understand. But what disturbed me most was the unsettling feeling it gave me. One night, after watching a scary movie with my parents, I lay in bed struggling to fall asleep. My mind replayed every frightening moment from the film. I heard something coming from the closet, the unmistakable sound of a toy falling and scattering on the floor. My heart raced as I bolted out of bed and ran to my parents' room. They comforted me, brushing it off as nothing but imagination. But the next night it happened again. This time, the sound of Legos spilling over filled the room. I ran to my parents again, and though my father became impatient with my fear, they let me sleep in their room. The following night, I heard the closet door creak open with force, and the moonlight cast a shadow across the room. I saw a figure standing by the door, and my scream pierced the air as I was overwhelmed with terror. The figure quickly fled the room, and my parents, in a panic, searched the house. They never found anyone, and the police were never able to track down the intruder. That night marked a deep, permanent fear I carried with me, and as an adult, I realized how vulnerable and powerless I felt. That experience taught me the importance of trusting our instincts. When something feels wrong, it often is. If you enjoyed this chilling story, make sure to subscribe for more unsettling tales that will keep you up at night. Years later, on a school trip to Louisiana, I found myself standing inside Myrtle's plantation, a place famed for its paranormal activity. Our tour guide was explaining the eerie history of the plantation when something unusual caught my attention. From somewhere in the room, I heard the faintest sound, like a piano key being struck one note at a time. I looked around, but there was no piano. The sound continued, and I became uneasy. I asked my friends if they could hear it, but they didn't seem to notice anything unusual. That's when a woman in the group caught my attention. She pointed at me, then at her ear, silently asking if I could hear it too. I nodded, and she whispered that she heard the same thing. The tour guide went on to share the haunting tale of a soldier who once lived there, who was known to play the piano late at night. According to the stories, many visitors had heard his piano playing during their stays. I couldn't help but wonder, was it just my imagination, or had we experienced something truly paranormal? After talking to the woman after the tour, she confirmed she heard the same sound, but her family had been oblivious. To this day, I don't know what I heard that day, but it made me question the boundaries between the living and the dead. Sometimes, we experience things that don't fit into the world we know, and we must learn to accept that some mysteries are beyond explanation. If you're intrigued by the supernatural, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more ghostly encounters. In high school, I remember a strange story my friend told me about her parents' first date. She was hesitant to share it because it still unsettled her, but we pressed her, and she reluctantly began. Her parents had gone on an awkward first date, and towards the end of the evening, decided to take a midnight hike up Provo Canyon. They walked along a dark trail, guided only by the stars in the sky. But as they approached a section where the path passed under some trees, both of them started feeling uneasy. Her dad tried to ignore the sensation, but it grew stronger as he continued down the path. Suddenly, his foot struck something soft in the dark. He didn't investigate, but instead turned around, feeling the need to leave immediately. They quickly ran back, and years later, when they watched an interview with Ted Bundy, the infamous serial killer, they were shocked. Bundy spoke about how, in Provo Canyon, he had just killed a woman when he heard two people coming up the path. He hid just in time, watching as a man unknowingly walked right over the body and then turned back. That story still haunts me. Shucks. Fact that they had unknowingly crossed paths with such danger, only to walk away unscathed, was nothing short of chilling. Sometimes we are oblivious to the dangers around us, and yet, fate allows us to slip through untouched. In the late hours of a college night, I was cramming for a research paper in the library. The place was nearly empty, except for one other student, a boy working at a desk across from mine. We were both trying to finish assignments at the last minute, and the atmosphere felt eerie in the quiet building. I had been in the stacks, the basement area of the library, for a couple of hours when I began to hear something odd. The sound of pages flipping rapidly. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just my imagination. But the sound grew louder and more persistent, almost as if someone was frantically searching through a book. Annoyed, I started walking toward the source of the sound to ask them to stop. But as I walked, it suddenly stopped. I was confused, but I sat back down. Just as I was getting comfortable again, the sound resumed, this time even louder than before. I stood up and looked around with the other student. We searched the room, but there was no one there. No one had entered or left the room. The noise seemed to come from nowhere, and it left both of us shaken. It stopped again as soon as we walked back to our desks. When it resumed, this time it was right next to the other student's chair. He packed up his things and left, clearly disturbed. I was right behind him. We both left the stacks, and I never returned after dark. That experience taught me that some things just can't be explained, and sometimes the eeriest moments are the ones we can't see. If you find strange, unexplainable experiences fascinating, subscribe now to hear more stories that will challenge your perception of reality. During one of my fishing trips, I had a terrifying encounter that still haunts me. My wife and I had been fishing off the East Coast for a few days, when, on the second night, something unsettling happened. We were playing cards on the boat, enjoying the night air, when suddenly we heard the unmistakable sound of an old motorboat. We went outside to find a man in a small, dimly lit boat drifting toward us. He looked middle-aged, with a beard and a baseball cap. He asked if we had any spare gasoline. I told him no, and offered him a ride to shore, but he declined, claiming to have enough fuel. His response was strange and left us both feeling uneasy. He gave us a chilling smile before he turned and slowly drifted back into the darkness. Later, that night around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by my wife's terrified scream. I shot out of bed to find the same man standing in our cabin. Before I could even react, he was gone, and I heard the sound of his motorboat speeding away. My wife and I decided to return to shore immediately, and we reported the encounter to the authorities. To this day, we don't know what that man wanted, but it's an experience that has stayed with us forever. For more spine-chilling stories from the deep sea and beyond, make sure to subscribe. One night in my childhood bedroom, I felt something I couldn't explain. The room had a small alcove across from my bed, hidden in darkness because of a closet blocking the light. I was in my senior year of high school and had trouble sleeping. I felt a heavy, malicious stare on me, one I couldn't shake. I opened my eyes, and through the darkness I saw an indistinct figure standing in the corner. I quickly shut my eyes again, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the feeling only grew stronger. I heard the creaking of floorboards as if someone had stepped toward me. When I opened my eyes again, the figure had moved to the opposite corner. Fear took over me, and I covered myself with my blanket, hoping it would disappear. I didn't sleep at all that night, and to this day I still don't know what I saw, but I'll never forget that feeling of pure terror. During one of our first camping trips, my family and I decided to go deep into the woods, far away from any campsite. We found a small clearing and set up our tents. My brother and sister fell asleep quickly, but I had trouble finding comfort in my sleeping bag. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of the tent zipper opening. I froze, thinking it was my parents checking on me. But when I peeked outside, I realized no one was there. I crawled into my parents' tent to ask them if they had checked on me, but both of them were sound asleep. We realized someone had come into our tent while we were asleep, but no one knew who. I was terrified and couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, knowing we had been visited by a stranger. A hotel my parents stayed at on their honeymoon had a strange experience that left them shaken. After checking into their room, they noticed a strong smell of fresh paint, even though they had been told it was a non-smoking room. When they mentioned this to the front desk, they were told there was no painting scheduled for that day. But when they returned to their room, the smell was unbearable. They complained again, and when they returned to their floor, the painter was gone. The supplies had been cleaned up in record time. Later, they overheard a tour guide explaining that a painter had died there years ago after falling down an elevator shaft. My parents were left with no answers, but they never forgot the eerie feeling of that encounter. Lastly, my cousin Nikki had an experience that still sends chills down my spine. One night while he was on Skype with his girlfriend Sam, he noticed her closet door slowly opening behind her. Sam dismissed it, claiming it was just a draft, but as the door opened further, Nikki realized something was wrong. He told Sam it was probably her little brother hiding in the closet, but Sam assured him she was home alone. Panic set in when Nikki saw a figure step out of the closet and walk across the room. Sam didn't notice, but Nikki was horrified. He immediately told her to lock her door and call the police. When Nikki arrived at her house, the front door was wide open. Sam was found huddled in her room, terrified, but the intruder was gone. This chilling encounter left them with more questions than answers. If you've been captivated by these spine-chilling encounters, make sure to subscribe for more. The truth might be closer than you think. It was a dark and stormy night when Evan's life, already tainted by the strange happenings in his childhood home, took a turn for the worse. He had always felt like there were forces at play beyond his understanding. Forces that existed in the unseen spaces of the world, lurking just beyond the edges of perception. The eerie incidents that had once terrified him as a child had grown into a constant gnawing presence in his mind, even as an adult. Evan had spent years trying to rationalize the strange occurrences, the toys spilling out of the closet, the figure that had appeared in the moonlight. His parents had dismissed it as nothing more than childhood imagination, but the deep, unresolved fear he had carried with him all those years never quite went away. At 28, Evan found himself living alone in an apartment on the outskirts of the city. He had moved far from the house he grew up in, hoping that time and distance would help him forget the things that had haunted him. Yet, the unease he had felt as a child had never fully left him. He tried to convince himself that it was all just a figment of his imagination, that there was nothing supernatural about the experiences he had as a kid. Still, the memories would resurface at night, especially when he found himself alone in the dark. One evening, as the wind howled outside his apartment window and the rain beat against the glass, Evan began to feel that familiar sense of dread creeping back into his chest. It had been years since he'd felt that way, but tonight, the unease was overwhelming. He tried to shake it off, blaming it on the storm, but the feeling of being watched was too strong. He stood up from his desk and walked over to the window, peering out into the night. The streetlights outside flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance on the wet pavement below. That's when he heard it, the faintest creak of the floorboard behind him. His heart skipped a beat. Evan spun around, but the room was empty. The sensation of being watched intensified, and his skin prickled with a cold sweat. He was alone. He had always been alone in this apartment. So why did it feel like someone was standing right behind him, just out of view? The air seemed to grow thick with tension. Evan's pulse quickened, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just the storm playing tricks on him. But then he heard it again, a slow, deliberate creak followed by a faint rustling sound as if someone was moving across the floor. Evan's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded in his chest as the fear that had plagued him in childhood flooded back. This time, it wasn't just in his mind, something was there. Something was in his apartment and it was moving toward him. He grabbed a flashlight from his desk and moved cautiously toward the source of the noise, his steps hesitant, his hands shaking. The apartment was small, just a bedroom, a living area, and a kitchen. The light from the flashlight barely illuminated the dark corners of the room, casting long, grotesque shadows. As he moved further into the room, the rustling sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the closet. For a moment, Evan stood frozen, his mind racing. He didn't want to face whatever was inside that closet, but his curiosity and the overwhelming need to confront whatever was haunting him drove him forward. He approached the closet, the sound growing more pronounced with each step. The door to the closet stood slightly ajar, and Evan could see the faint outline of something inside, something that didn't belong. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open, shining his flashlight. Inside, his breath caught in his throat as his eyes scanned the darkness. There was nothing there. The closet was empty, but just as he began to relax, a sharp sound sliced through the air, the unmistakable noise of something moving in the shadows. The flashlight flickered, and in that instant, he saw it. A figure stood in the far corner of the closet, its outline faint but unmistakable. Evan's stomach churned as the figure stepped forward, slowly emerging from the darkness. It was tall, its features obscured by the dim light, but there was no mistaking the malice that radiated from it. The figure was humanoid, yet something about its movements was wrong. Unnatural, jerky, as if it were not entirely real. Evan took a step back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs felt as if they were glued to the floor. The figure took another step forward, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark like two pools of liquid darkness. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. Evan stood in complete darkness, his heartbeat thundering in his chest. He could hear the figure breathing, slow and labored, as if it were drawing closer, its presence overwhelming him. He fumbled in his pocket for his phone, but before he could reach it, he heard a low, guttural growl. The sound echoed in the silence, sending a wave of terror crashing over him. In that moment, the darkness seemed to close in around him. Evan could feel the figure's presence moving closer, its breath cold on his skin. He stumbled backward, finally breaking free of the paralysis that had gripped him. He ran toward the door, flinging it open and bolting out into the hallway, his heart racing with fear. But just as he reached the door to the stairwell, something stopped him. A voice, soft but unmistakable, whispered his name from behind. Evan. He turned around, his body trembling. The figure was standing in the hallway now, its eyes locked onto his, its mouth stretching into a grotesque smile. It took a step forward, and with it, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. Evan could feel the cold seeping into his bones as the figure closed the gap between them. His breath caught in his throat as he realized that the creature wasn't just an illusion. It wasn't just a figment of his childhood fears. It was real, and it had been following him all these years. In a final burst of adrenaline, Evan shoved open the door to the stairwell and ran down the steps, not daring to look back. He didn't stop until he reached the street below, his legs burning from the effort. He paused, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but when he looked up, his blood ran cold. The figure stood at the edge of the building, watching him from the shadows. As the storm raged around him, Evan realized that his past had caught up with him. The things he had thought were just childhood nightmares were real, and they had been following him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Make sure to subscribe to this channel for more terrifying, mind-bending tales that will leave you questioning everything you know about reality. As the storm raged outside and the shadowy figure loomed over Evan, a profound realization began to settle in his heart. It wasn't the terror or the chills that gripped him that night. It was the understanding that the fears and phantoms of the past didn't just fade away with time. They followed him silently, patiently, lurking in the corners of his mind, waiting for the right moment to resurface. But the true horror was not the creature itself, or the frightening experiences that had marked his childhood, but rather the idea that fear had such a strong grip on him. The encounter with the unknown, with the inexplicable, serves as a metaphor for many of the struggles we face in life. How often do we try to bury our fears, our past, or the memories that cause us discomfort, hoping they'll disappear with time? How often do we think that if we ignore them, they'll go away? Evan's story teaches us that fear, whether it's about the supernatural or the personal struggles we face, isn't something that can be outrun or left behind. It's something that must be confronted. Just as Evan had to face the terrifying figure from his past, we too must face the fears and unresolved experiences that we carry with us. Ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. It only allows them to fester, waiting for the right time to overwhelm us. His journey, while filled with fear and confusion, is a reminder that there is strength in facing what scares us most. It's in the confronting of those fears that we gain the ability to truly move forward. The creature Evan saw that night wasn't just a manifestation of his childhood trauma. It was a reflection of the emotional and psychological burdens that many of us carry, unresolved, unaddressed, and waiting for the moment when we are least prepared. Evan's decision to confront the figure, to run from it rather than submit to it, is symbolic of how we must face our challenges head-on. It shows that while the journey may be difficult and frightening, the only way to free ourselves from the grip of fear is through courage and action. We can't avoid the storm forever, and sometimes we can't outrun the past. But what we can do is decide how we respond when it catches up with us. The message here is not just about the fear of the unknown. It's about reclaiming power over our own lives. When we face our fears, when we take control of our narrative rather than let the unknown dictate it, we regain our strength. And while the supernatural elements of the story may be terrifying, they serve as a powerful metaphor for the human condition. Each of us has an unseen force, whether it's fear, doubt, or unresolved pain that haunts us. But we are not powerless in the face of it. The courage to face our demons, however terrifying they may seem, is what leads us to our greatest growth. So, as you read this story and reflect on the events that transpired, remember, it's not the fear that defines us, but our ability to confront it. It's not the shadows that haunt us, but how we choose to step into the light. Let Evan's story inspire you to face the things that haunt you, whether they are ghosts of the past or the fears that linger in your heart. Only by acknowledging them, confronting them, and learning from them can we truly move forward. And just like Evan, we can emerge from the darkness stronger and more resilient, knowing that fear, in the end, is only as powerful as we allow it to be. So take a step forward, face the fear, embrace the unknown, and remember that the true courage lies not in avoiding what scares us, but in rising to meet it.